Hello, and welcome to my second episode of the What Are You Reading podcast. Today's guest is a professor of mine, Dr. Amy Fluker, history professor, her focus being 19th century. And today we'll discuss Civil War, we'll discuss the book Demons of Unrest by Eric Larson, and a few points from that book. Hopefully you'll enjoy. And quick heads up, again, I had technical difficulties, so no video of me. So again, I am not the star of these episodes. It's the person I'm talking to. They're the smarter person here, so they should get all the attention. So I'll talk to you guys at the end of the podcast. And again, thank you for watching. How's your day been?
Good.
All right.
Yeah, no complaints.
So my first question is, what are you reading?
I am reading a really interesting book called The Apparitionists. It's about the spiritualist movement of the 19th century, and it's about this guy, Mumler, who took spirit photographs, and how he was tried for fraud in about, I can't remember now, 1868, maybe something like that. So, yeah, interesting.
Yeah, I remember you were interested in supernatural subject matter.
Yep.
Thought it'd be interesting to share with you. Research for a future novel of mine involves two books about ghosts.
Oh, yeah?
Like they're, I don't know if you call them nonfiction, but they're supposed to be encyclopedias about it.
Oh, okay.
So, if you wanted to share with the viewer, what is your background?
So I am a professor of history. I specialize in 19th century American history and in the history of the American Civil War. I also have subfields in women's history and the history of total war. So a little bit of war, a lot of cultural history. That's what I do.
All right, real quick, I'm just going to check something. So I understand you've written a book.
Yeah.
And you said I don't know if you're ready to promote your next
Sure.
book yet, but if you want to promote either one, you're welcome to do so.
Okay. Thanks. Yeah, so my first book is called Commonwealth of Compromise, Civil War Commemoration in Missouri. And it's about how basically the survivors of the Civil War in Missouri had a really difficult task when it came to trying to write and commemorate the history of the war, because it was a border state, so the people there were very divided by the war, and so the book looks at how they deal with that in its aftermath. And the second book project deals with my interest in the supernatural. It is under review right now. We're hoping it'll be out in about a year, so hopefully spring of 26. But it deals with Civil War ghost stories, the stories that Civil War veterans told about ghostly things they experienced during the war, and how those stories can help us better understand the experience of the war. So it's been a lot of fun to research.
Okay. And next question is, what piqued your interest in history?
My family has always been interested in history, so it came really naturally to me, but I do remember in the 4th grade learning about the Civil War for the first time. And I came home and I told my mom and dad, oh, we learned about the Civil War. Did you have any idea that this happened? And North versus the South, and it was this huge fight, and it was so exciting. And my parents told me, oh yeah, of course we know about the Civil War. Did you know you had a relative who fought in the war? And I did not know, because I was in 4th grade. But so that really made it personal, and so my interest really grew from there. But it was always the Civil War. That was sort of my first love in history, and still is.
Yeah, I don't know if I ever shared it, but in a way, my first historical entry was World War II.
Mm-hmm.
But since you wrote a nonfiction book, do you have advice for people who want to get into nonfiction writing?
Yeah, I think people who write nonfiction are, how do I want to say that? There's we don't get any sort of preparation for how you market your work. Because I think a lot of people who write fiction maybe come into publishing from the side of disciplines of English or literary studies, and they have sort of a better idea about what you do once your book is done. And we're not trained to think about that at all in the historical profession or in sort of the nonfiction world. So what surprised me was, yeah, your book's published, but then it's really up to you to figure out how to market it. So you have to wear many hats. You have to be a researcher and a writer, and then you have to be your own publicist. And so I would just say anyone who's interested in nonfiction, just think about that. Think about things that you want to do to promote your book, and don't be afraid to make opportunities for yourself. So I discovered that, if you want to have book talk, you got to invite yourself to places to give book talks. So contacting libraries and historical sites and saying, hey, this is what I can come speak about. Would you have me? And most times people are really happy to do that. But yeah, you have to be your own publicist, which is not something I expected.
Yeah, I feel like I could say I've learned a lot just from self-publishing. I didn't take this. I'm not from the traditional writing route, so I don't have that education on how to publish a book or anything. I just sort of self-taught and used YouTube and whatnot. But
yeah, and you're in a similar way, I'm sure. Then it's your own pocket and your own dime, because you're not working with a publisher who has resources to spend on marketing your stuff. That's kind of a similar thing with nonfiction writing too.
Right. So I do have 2 writing projects coming up, probably 1 in 10 years, depending on my research. But they both do have a connection to the Civil War themselves. And I figured maybe I could ask you some questions about them, and you could help shed some light on if I would continue writing them or not.
Sure.
And the first question I had was, from the few sources I've learned about the Civil War and the Southern perspective, would it be safe to say, or could the suggestion be made that the South was somewhat militarized?
Yeah, so that's been a long-standing argument that Civil War historians have made, that the 2 belligerent powers enter the Civil War, the United States and the Confederate States, and the United States has all these advantages. They have far more resources and they have far more soldiers, but the Confederacy has this really accomplished group of leaders, because Southern culture, the argument goes, was very martial. So that to manhood in the South, like to be an honorable man, to be an important man, meant to have some kind of military training. So it was definitely customary in antebellum Southern society for men to be members of the militia. And so there's a martial culture there. It also must be said, not only are they members of the militia, but they have sort of no professionalized police forces, and so slave patrols are composed of white Southern men who would be effectively policing. So that's a sort of kind of military or paramilitary experience too. So yeah, I hope that answers your question. Yeah, there's certainly been the argument made over time that antebellum Southern culture was placed an emphasis on military service, and that was a particular mark of respectability for men to pursue. That was how you established yourself as an important man in Southern society, was having some kind of relationship to the military.
And then another point I was going to ask was, can you explain the power of the plantation owners in the Southern states?
Yeah, the power of the planter class, the planter elite. I think kind of difficult to imagine from a modern perspective, because ultimately they're a very tiny minority. So the statistic that historians use all the time is that less than a quarter of white Southerners own slaves. And the numbers of people that we would call planters, elite planters, plantation owners, is even smaller than that. So they are a tiny minority of the population of the South, but they completely dominate the politics, the culture, and the economics of the South. So they're a tiny elite that pulls all the strings. To the extent that in some places, in South Carolina, for instance, to be a member of the state legislature, you had to be a slave owner, right? So the people who are in power represent this tiny minority of the population, and so their power is extreme. They have capital in the sense that they have real capital, they have money, but they have cultural capital in terms of they're the elite, they're the trendsetters. They're the people that, families aspire to be like. White Southerners aspire to be like them. So they have an amazing amount of control over a wide range of dependents. Poor whites, women, enslaved people, children. The Planter class really ruled in the South in a way, like I said, I think it's kind of difficult to imagine now. A kind of aristocracy, basically. And they certainly thought of themselves that way. They really liked to draw parallels between themselves and the nobility of Europe, particularly England. So they really enjoyed, for example, Arthurian legends and like the writings of Sir Walter Scott. They liked to think of themselves as American nobility.
Okay. Like I said, the camera is kind of the backup in case somebody messes up here, and someone did mess up.
Oh, no, okay.
So to continue off the point about the plantation owners and kind of their noble view, I kind of brought an example from my knowledge of World War II, and that was a book I read recently called Panzer Commander by Hans von Luck. And he talks about growing up in the Prussian kind of noble society. And you kind of touched on it, but could it be safe to say, like, in a way, the noble society of Europe they did take away a lot from the noble society of Europe?
Yeah, they certainly are, modeling themselves off of that aristocratic class, and they, weirdly will sort of argue that in some ways their version is superior to the European version of aristocracy, because they'll say, right, because so much of their energy is spent defending the institution of slavery, particularly as we get closer to the Civil War, and slavery is coming under attack, not just internationally. Not only are Europeans critical of the institution of slavery, but more Northern Americans are criticizing the institution too. So they have to come up with some kind of defense. And what they'll say is, slavery creates a more pure and noble society in America than exists anywhere else, because our laboring class are people of color who they believe are racially inferior. So forcing them to do all the drudge work elevates the rest of Southern society to pursue cultural things. So because white people in the American South don't have to do any of the terrible manual labor associated with the plantation economy, then this elevates the status of white people to pursue cultural things, education and politics and the arts and etc. So they'll say that, actually our version of nobility and aristocracy is better because we have a racial hierarchy here in America that doesn't exist in Europe.
And one of the comparisons, I guess this is kind of shedding light on what one of my books is about, but would it be fair to compare German officers of the early 20th century to Confederate officers?
You're talking specifically like World War I era before?
World War I, World War II era.
Yeah. So it's a really natural comparison. I don't have a great answer for you, but it's certainly something that you'll see people talk about, particularly comparing the Confederacy to Nazi Germany. Because I think maybe what your question is getting at is, to what degree are these officers, what degree are these leaders complicit in the crimes that their nations perpetrate? And I think in a similar way, in the Second World War, you'll often hear people talk about the idea of the good German, the idea that German soldiers and even officers to some extent were just simply caught up in a bad system, and if they did bad things, it wasn't really their fault because they were being taken advantage of by this cruel state. And you can see the same kind of thing happening in the context of the American Civil War, where people will basically say, the system might have been white supremacist, the system might have encouraged a traitorous rebellion, but we shouldn't hold these individual Confederate men responsible. And honestly, they don't. There are I can only think of two prosecutions of Confederate officers as war criminals. And one, officer is kind of a loose term for him because he was like a guerrilla soldier. Mm-hmm. So there's sort of like one official prosecution of a Confederate officer for any kind of complicity in a war crime. So my point is, I think there is a parallel in terms of a question that Civil War historians grapple with, that I think people grapple with in the case of German, officers, is, to what degree are these people responsible for, the atrocities associated with the wars they helped fight?
Mm-hmm. I guess one of my points was also the loyalty of both groups willing to stick to their guns, so to speak. So kind of diverging towards a different book I had in mind. A little bit of a lead up to this question. A video game I like to play.
Okay.
It's called LA Noire.
Yeah.
And it's a kind of a police detective game where you play as an LA detective in the late 40s, and you have to deal with different corruption, different crimes. I think they even have like the Black Dahlia murder in it. But one of the cases that the character gets involved in is U.S. military personnel steal supplies of morphine, and they go to sell them on the black market. And I guess when I first played this game and I first experienced that, it was hard for me then to imagine veterans getting into criminal activity.
Oh, yeah.
And I could partially imagine maybe in the Civil War there was definitely signs of that.
Yeah, that's a really, really interesting question. And so a lot of my work deals with Civil War veterans. I mentioned my book talks about, what are people doing and saying about the war when they get home? So yeah, most of my research is focused on veterans. I haven't specifically examined crime, but I've certainly seen in my research, for example, pervasive problems of alcohol abuse among Civil War veterans, which is of course a contributing factor to crime, particularly domestic violence. So that's what I see more often than not in my own research. But there was also a really interesting concern in the post-Civil War era that kind of relates to what you're talking about is, I think today we have a sense that, veterans have an elevated status in our society, right? You honor them at football games. We honor them at our graduation ceremonies, right? To be a veteran means you've kind of earned the respect of your community in, our current context. But that wasn't true in the aftermath of the Civil War. There were deserving veterans and undeserving veterans. And a deserving veteran was somebody who had a spotless military record, honorable discharge, who was continuing to support themselves and live a productive life following the war. The undeserving veterans were the ones who couldn't hold down a job, who were disabled, physically disabled, or potentially, suffering from war-related trauma, psychological trauma, who couldn't hold down a job, who couldn't keep their families together, who suffered from alcoholism. And those men might be institutionalized, they might be put in veterans' homes, and they were certainly looked down on as a sort of second class of society. So that's the element where you would find this, this kind of criminality associated with veterans that you're kind of talking about. The kind of more specific thing I can relate to what you encountered in this game, in my research into the Missouri Federal Soldiers' Home, I found some letters from the superintendent who was managing that home complaining that the veterans there were running a moonshine operation. So they were bootlegging out of the veterans' home and selling stuff to locals out in the county. So it's kind of similar to this black market drug trade you're talking about. So yeah, absolutely that existed in the Civil War era.
To kind of continue off of that, I did read a book about the bonus army.
Yeah.
I want to say a few months ago, and it definitely shed light on the experience veterans had from the Civil War up to World War II. And it definitely goes into how they were kind of considered second-class citizens, and in a way, the government and a lot of people didn't really think they were responsible for basically giving them a step up again.
Yeah, exactly. You're exactly right. That's a really, I think, a really powerful parallel that the government, the state is trying to figure out what it owes its veterans. And in the case of the American Civil War, the government will establish national homes and services, pensions for Civil War soldiers, but a lot of the support comes from private charity, comes from veterans organizations, and a women's organization called the Women's Relief Corps that, they're spending a lot of private money and, volunteer efforts supporting veterans. And so that idea that there's this second class of veteran who exists, who might not have a job, who might not, have money, who might not be able to support himself or the family, that's the same concern that the bonus army is going to have, like you said, 50 years later? from these pensions that I'm talking about, these pension programs. And so, yeah, the idea that the state has so kind of distanced itself from these men from their service that you can actually mobilize the armed forces against those bonus marchers and turn them out of Washington, D.C. You can use the military against your veterans who are making claims to services that, it's really interesting and thorny. And,
Yeah, it was definitely interesting sharing what I learned from that book with others, like my mom, who's not much of a history buff herself, but definitely showing like how the government turned on the veterans in a way.
I would be interested in getting the title because I have 2 books about the bonus army, but they're pretty old now, so I'm interested if this is a newer one that I don't know about yet.
I'll tell you after the interview.
That'd be great.
So another question, research for my novel was one of my research books at home for the novel itself is a biography on Jesse James.
Oh, yeah.
And from what I know about him is 2 or 3 documentaries, and they kind of give him a kind of a Robin Hood perspective, or Robin Hood status. I was just curious, would it be safe to say, or would it be said that Jesse James was an anomaly among the veterans at that time?
Yeah, absolutely. He's an anomaly. And I'm glad that you brought him up because, of course, you asked me sort of how I came to history. I grew up in Missouri. Jesse James is a big deal there, or was. We learned, so there's a song called The Ballad of Jesse James. I don't know if you've encountered this. I will not sing it for you, but you can give it a Google. The Ballad of Jesse James. We learned it in grade school. So, yeah, he certainly has this popular image, as this kind of Robin Hood-like character that you said. But, of course, ultimately he's a thief and a murderer. But he's a guy, he's not anomalous in the sense that he is somebody who is damaged by the war. He witnesses his stepfather being lynched. His family, their home is bombed, and his relatives are maimed and killed in an explosion. He's a teenager, and he is caught in a really horrific theater of the war in which he suffers really horrific things. And I'm not a psychiatrist, but I say he was damaged by it. And he's not an anomalous in the sense that he's damaged by the war, because I think many, many people were. But he is anomalous in the sense that he does very blatantly turn to crime. We talked about there's all kinds of ways that veterans suffer in the aftermath of the war and might turn to criminality, but James is somebody who makes a very deliberate choice to pursue criminality. And so, yeah, he's very anomalous in that way, but like I said, he comes also from a really unique context. He's not a typical Civil War soldier. He was a guerrilla, so he was somebody who fought the Civil War with basically no rules. He was not the only guerrilla. There were many of them, but we're talking about, versus probably nearly, 1.4, 1.5 million men in the regular army. So veterans who experience of the war is coming from the regular army versus somebody like James who's coming out of this, corner of the war where irregular warfare is the rule of the day. So yeah, he's, I guess, anomalous in that sense. Right? He belongs to a very particular set of men that do not represent the vast majority of soldiers who fought in this war. But yeah, he's a interesting character for sure.
Yeah, I don't know if I was going to explain a little bit. Try to share my brainstorm idea for this novel without giving too much to it. To be fair, I sometimes think to myself, maybe if I do give enough to it, someone will write a better book, and I'll probably enjoy that better. But it's about a group of Confederate veterans who turn to crime, and also ties in your interest in supernatural. They do run into a supernatural phenomenon that later in the book, and they kind of have to deal with that. I always had the idea of a Western with a supernatural theme.
Yeah, that sounds really interesting. And yeah, so Civil War historians, I can recommend definitely a couple of books to you that you might be interested in that deal with Jesse James, how people think about him and his connection to the West and mythologies associated with the West. So there's been, a handful of good stuff written on Jesse James that tie into those kind of themes. And I would just say, too, in terms of advice for writers, look, don't be worried about people stealing your ideas. Like, keep them close, but no one's ever going to write the same book as you. And Civil War historians are more aware of that than I think a lot of people, because so many people write on the Civil War. I mean, think of how many biographies there are of Abraham Lincoln.
Yeah.
One of the little facts that his Civil War historians will spit out is that there's been a book published about the Civil War every day since it happened, basically. That's the volume of books we're talking about. So even if someone else writes a similar idea, right, that's okay. There's room for everybody, and no one's going to write exactly the same book that you have in mind. So keep your ideas close, but don't be too worried about them.
Right. And, so the next point kind of goes away from my books, but the thought I've always been having lately was, would you say the Civil War has a claim to being maybe one of the first modern wars?
Yeah, so I mentioned that one of my fields of study when I was a grad student was in total war. And so I spent a lot of time thinking about that question as a graduate student. Yes, that argument has certainly been made. There's the field has kind of turned away from this debate now, but I would say in the 80s and 90s there was a pretty strong divide amongst Civil War historians about whether or not they would consider it the first modern war or total war or not. I'm not sure where I stand on that, so I guess I can kind of make a brief case for both sides. So it's either a total war in which sort of all aspects of society and culture are dedicated to the war effort, a war in which the line between combatants and non-combatants is effectively erased. That's kind of what we think of when we think of total war. And this idea of modernity, right? A total war is also one in which technology is making killing more efficient, easier, inflicting more widespread destruction. Those are just some of the kind of things that we would toss under the term of modern war, total war. Versus a limited war, where your combatants are primarily armies, and they are following rules of war, and they are trying to limit their impact on civilian populations, etc. You can find examples of both things in the American Civil War. Certainly in places where guerrilla warfare was common, like we were talking about Jesse James. In some ways, those are very modern wars, right? We have instances of like urban warfare in the American Civil War, where fighting is happening in the heart of civilian communities. Civilians are absolutely targeted and suffer as a consequence of their exposure to the fighting. And we have the development of new technologies and tactics like trench warfare and sieges, the siege of Petersburg at the end of the war, the use of trains and telegraphs. There's all kinds of modern things that are part of Civil War combat. Other historians would come back and say, yeah, that's true, and certainly many, many civilians are going to be impacted by this war. In fact, one of the leading Civil War historians, this guy James McPherson, has basically said, we'll never know how many civilians died in the war. It's probably higher than 50,000. We'll never know. We'll never know. So certainly many thousands, tens of thousands of civilians died as a result of this war. However, if you look at the rules of war, and the United States government during the course of the war very deliberately creates a set of rules. It's called the Lieber Code. And it basically says what the U.S. Army can and can't do, what's appropriate and what's not appropriate. You must not attack civilian centers or homes if it can be avoided. Unless they're attacking you, you're not to attack them. You're not to attack hospitals. You're not to attack churches. You're not to attack places of education, places of cultural significance, right? There are some things that are off limits. And of course, during the Civil War, that line gets crossed. But the rule is there, right? And so some historians have said that's really important to remember. And so, the Civil War may be tipping into modernity, but it's ultimately far more limited than the conflicts that are going to come in the 20th century.
There you go off the point about that. Then you can make an argument about that is in modern warfare they do have the rules of engagement. So, naturally, like a soldier can't shoot at someone. I heard a veteran says you could see them with a gun and they could be pointing it at you, but you can't shoot at them until they fire upon you. So...
And that's interesting because that's exactly the same thing, for example, that William Tecumseh Sherman and the U.S. Army kind of says. And so when people think about the Civil War as a modern war or total war, they'll point at Sherman and talk about his march to the sea, which explicitly targets a civilian population. And people throughout history have painted it as a criminal action, basically. As an abuse of power and as being really destructive and damaging to civilians. technically Sherman says he gives very clear orders that you are not to attack homes, you're not to destroy property unless you are fired upon first, which relates to what you were saying. Of course, that's what he says, right? What his men do, ultimately, he doesn't have a ton of control over because his line is spread out to such an extent. So historians have debated about that. And like I said, for a while there was a really major conversation in the field. Are you one of the total war people or are you one of the limited war people? And they definitely had strong opinions about one another. The debates kind of died down, and I think most historians now would say there's elements of modernity in the Civil War, particularly in the use of technology and the way in which the war impacts non-combatants. But ultimately, as I said, it's very different than the world wars that follow.
And I always hear World War I being considered the first modern warfare, but in a way you could also say maybe Vietnam is probably even more.
Yeah, and I'm glad you mentioned that because I started to mention, when I was first responding to it, I started to mention guerrilla war, which of course the tactics that we associate with guerrilla war and the Civil War relate to the tactics of irregular warfare that, American troops were dealing with in Vietnam. So there's sort of a parallel there in terms of a shift away from this sort of Napoleonic style of combat with, men lined up in neat rows charging at one another across the field, and a turn towards these kind of irregular hit and run sort of tactics. Again, not particularly new. Those things happened in the War for Independence. They happened throughout the history of warfare, but in the American Civil War, those kinds of tactics are authorized. The Confederate government, for example, creates the Partisan Ranger Act, and they give these kind of loose bands of guerrillas power to carry on those kinds of, what we want to say, hit and run, kind of seek and destroy kind of tactics. And so maybe there's something modern there as well, like you said, that explicitly connects to the conflict in Vietnam.
Kind of go off that, I didn't include this in the questions, but I did read a book I think a year or so ago for research for the recent novel I published was History of the Army Rangers, and the author includes the Civil War, although there wasn't really technically an Army Ranger like today's battalions, but he mentions, I forget the name of the officer in the Confederate Army. There was a unit that pushed north into Ohio.
Oh, yeah, John Hunt Morgan. Yeah, so there's a couple really famous partisan rangers who, like I said, the Confederate government authorizes them to kind of operate outside of the jurisdiction of the regular command of the Confederate Army. And so there's a handful of these guys. A couple of the most famous are John Hunt Morgan, who will famously lead a raid into the lower Midwest, into Indiana, into Ohio. He gets captured in Ohio and thrown in the penitentiary in Columbus and then escapes, and it becomes this major kind of sensation. The other famous partisan ranger who I thought you were going to mention was a guy named John Singleton Mosby, who came in and out, was associated with the cavalry commander Jeb Stuart on the Confederate side, but he pioneered these kinds of guerrilla tactics, and so he was another famous character of the war. Morgan and Mosby gets nicknamed the Gray Ghost for his the kinds of ways he fought. But yeah.
My next question, thinking about a little bit the way I've written it, the Civil War kind of took place in the middle of the Industrial Revolution, or at least maybe the beginning of the American side of it. I know England was far into it by this time. Right. But one of the things I took away from Max Hastings' book about World War II, early in the book he says, out of so many Americans who had amputations during that war, like I forget the percentage, only like 8% of them were combat related. The rest were industrial accidents. Interesting. And
he's saying that about the Civil War era, or he's about
World War II, but
okay.
Comparing to the Civil War, I do understand limb loss was definitely a higher rate probably in the Civil War than World War II, but I'm curious if the stat is still kind of there where it comes to industrial injury.
Yeah, unfortunately I can't speak to that. You're right. Industrialization sort of gets underway in the U.S. in the 1820s, 1830s, and certainly the northern states are industrializing more rapidly than the southern states. There are accounts of industrial accidents during the war. The only ones I can think of at the moment relate to arsenals, right, where they're making explosives, bullets, cartridges, or explosives. There's detonation. So I think the kinds of machinery that we're talking about in the Civil War era might not lend themselves to the kinds of physical damage that we'll see when heavy industry becomes more thing. But yeah, certainly there are industrial accidents. But the people who are victims of those that I can think of off the top of my head were actually women. So it was women who are working in these munitions factories that there's a couple famous explosions. One is just across the line, the Allegheny Arsenal near Pittsburgh. That's the worst one. And I can't remember the numbers there, but a number of women are killed in an explosion there. But yeah, amputations are a famous thing associated with the American Civil War, and it would be interesting to see comparative numbers to later conflicts because it all has to do with, as I think you were suggesting, medical science. So by the time we get to the Second World War, they have a better idea of how they can heal wounds in your appendages before they begin to suffer. And of course, penicillin is makes a huge difference. So in the Civil War, if you're struck in an appendage, their ability to heal that wound is not great, and so it's probably safer to do, conduct an amputation. And so we have this idea that it's butchery, we just had all these terrible surgeons who didn't know what they were doing. They're just mutilating these poor men, and it's that was the medical science at the time, and I'm sure it did save lives. But yeah, there's been some really great works written on amputation and the experiences of amputees after the war in the context of the Civil War. And again, the kind of conventional wisdom now is that many amputations happen, and we shouldn't think of it necessarily as a consequence of bad science. It's just that that was the solution they had available to them at the time.
My next question, I realized I did send questions to you before, and sorry I got the titles mixed up, but have you read Eric Larson's book? It's his most recent one, Demon of Unrest.
Oh, no, I have not, but of course I've seen it around. Yeah, have you read it?
I had finished it last night.
Yeah.
I could say that's where I got a lot of my knowledge from it, just from reading that and about at least the beginning of the Civil War.
Yeah.
And I was wondering if I could bring up some points,
Sure.
even if you didn't read it. One of the things I found interesting when I was reading it was just the population, both of total of both United States, including the Confederacy in general, at that time, and then the difference between the two, if you mind. Go.
Yeah. So this is a really important piece of understanding the American Civil War is the difference in population between the United States and the Confederate States, but then particularly the difference in population of military-age men. I can't remember the exact numbers off the top of my head, but certainly the military-aged male population of the United States is almost twice that of the population in the Confederate States. And the other thing that I always tell my students, I think the population of the Confederate States is something like 9 million, but 4 million of them are enslaved. So the numbers, of free people living in the Confederate States is actually really small. And then the number of those who are military-age men, even smaller. And so the sizes of the two armies, are very different. And that becomes a major problem for the Confederate States, especially as the war goes on. And because of changes in tactics and because of advancements in technology, battles become deadlier and deadlier and deadlier. And the Confederate States cannot replace their manpower in the way that the United States can. Again, the numbers are going to be rough, and historians debate this a little bit. I would say the fighting strength of the Confederate Army is somewhere around 750,000 men, and the fighting strength of the U.S. Army is over 1 million. And so they certainly have a major advantage in terms of population, and a part of that is a lot of recent immigration from Ireland and Germany into the United States in the 1840s and 50s. And they weren't going to the Confederacy because you couldn't be an immigrant and break into the plantation economy in the way that you could be an immigrant and break into the industrial economy in the northern states.
Larson explains it pretty well in the book, where, for example, like the population, I believe, of Charleston or Columbia,
Mhm.
the capital
Yep.
of South Carolina. I think you said it was like 8,000 people.
Yeah.
And then you go to like look at New York's population
Yeah.
at the time.
I just went through these numbers with some of my students, and now I'm not going to be able to remember. But yeah, I think the only southern city that breaks the top 7 in terms of population in 1860 is, I want to say it's New Orleans, but Charleston is also larger. I think though New Orleans is the only southern city that makes it into the list of sizable, and its population is like maybe, again, double check me, internet, on the truth of this, but I want to say it's like 10,000, if that. So yeah, the population of Columbus, Ohio, right? That's just the number of immigrants that have moved in Columbus, Ohio, right? So, and that's just one tiny, relatively smaller city across the whole expanse of the United States. So yeah, very little urbanization and very little free, very small free population in the Confederate States.
And another point I took away from the book, maybe I got a little confused about it, was it seemed like the South was more mobilized at the time, or at the beginning of it.
So that's a really common thing that people sort of popularly believe about the Civil War, is that Southerners were more kind of energized to fight because they perceived this as a war, as an attack on them, that they were defending their homes and defending their way of life, and so that they were very, that they had a stronger emotional commitment to the war. I don't think that's necessarily true, and so I would definitely push back on that as a Civil War historian and say, the response to President Lincoln's call for volunteer soldiers after the assault on Fort Sumter, right? He asks for 75,000 volunteers. He's going to get hundreds of thousands of volunteers. Young Northern men are very committed to, and feel very emotionally engaged in fighting a war to save the Union and the Constitution. They're very passionate patriots, and they feel very strongly that the Confederacy has betrayed the country, and they're very, anxious to put down what they see as this traitorous rebellion and restore the Union. And they are very sentimental about it. And so I think we kind of, again, that's a very popular version of the Civil War, to say, oh yeah, these Southerners were, they were more committed because they're fighting for their homes and families, but that kind of minimizes the extent to which Northern people were very patriotic and very connected to and very passionate about saving their country. Inspired by the same kind of patriotic motivations that we'll see motivating like the Greatest Generation, the Second World War era. It's no different, right? They feel their country is under assault by a bunch of traitors and they want to fix it.
Right. Maybe my point, maybe I said it wrong, was looking at today's standard, the standing army is compared to back then would probably be very substantial, but I think it's like a couple million today. But my point was, like, for example, he brings up the relief sent to Fort Sumter that kind of spurred the attack on Fort Sumter itself.
Yeah.
And it was only maybe 6 or 7 ships.
Yeah, I can't remember the number, but yeah. You mean President Lincoln's decision to resupply the fort, and that's taken as the act of aggression that they need to open fire.
And then another point they bring up was Washington was, according to Larson, was in danger. They only had so many soldiers within Washington itself to defend it.
Yeah, that was a major concern for the U.S. Army in the opening weeks of the conflict. Yeah, you're right. The size of the standing army, they're scrambling, and that's why Lincoln issues that call for volunteers. 75,000 men to defend the rebellion. This isn't exactly what you were asking me about, but I was thinking too, again, in terms of this popular mythology of, like Southerners, being really behind the Confederate cause. One of the things that historians have said to kind of debunk that idea is, if you actually look at how many Southerners, and we're talking voters, Southerners who could vote, so free white men, there's not ever universal support for secession in the South. It was deeply conflicting and traumatic thing for people to agree on. So the only state that has a unanimous Declaration for Secession of South Carolina. The other Confederate states are very, very deeply divided. And again, because you live your whole life and your family's history, your community's history is tied into the identity of the United States. And now you're told we're no longer going to be a part of the United States. That's a tough transition for some people to make, and some white Southerners remain unwilling to make that transition and will oppose the Confederacy. We kind of forget about Southern Unionists in the broad history of the American Civil War.
And then 2 points. This is kind of maybe a conspiracy theory I just thought up on the spot, but the book kind of talks about how, in a way, Lincoln's cabinet, I forget the name of the individual, but they were kind of going behind his back and telling my brain's not working all of a sudden, but the group of kind of like the officials sent from the South to negotiate the and one of the things I noticed was the book talks about when Lincoln sent down 2 of his trusted individuals to see how heavy secession oriented the South was. I wonder if it manipulated his thoughts, and my theory was, did Lincoln want Fort Sumter attacked, do you think? Kind of an excuse to be the good guy
So that's a really tricky question, and I don't have a good answer for you, but it's definitely something that Lincoln historians have debated. I remember reading a book in college called Mr. Lincoln's Little War that made that case, that this was a very shrewd move on Lincoln's part. The decision to resupply Fort Sumter allowed him to bring this issue to a head without making an overt declaration of war. It allowed him to sort of put him in the position of responding to aggression from the Confederacy as opposed to being the aggressor. I don't know enough about Lincoln to answer your question, with any kind of authority. I haven't read his correspondence on the issue, but I will say he was a very smart and cagey, and I don't mean cagey in a dishonest way, but just very savvy guy. And so he absolutely knew that resupplying that fort would be regarded as an act of war, and South Carolina tells him that explicitly. So there's no scenario in which he blithely makes that decision to resupply the fort thinking, oh, well, maybe they won't have a problem with it, right? I'm sure he went into it with his eyes open, and I'm sure he went into that decision aware of what the consequence would be. So that's kind of as good an answer as I have without doing more research on.
Right. And of course, like modern examples of that type of theory is like World War II. One theory is FDR knew that Pearl Harbor was going to happen, and then of course the 9/11 theories and all that.
Right.
But another point that Larson brings up in his book, is in his introduction and in his acknowledgement at the end, was, by the way, if you want to try to stay as neutral as you want politically or whatever, I don't know if that affects you or.
No.
But he brings up a comparison between the attack on Fort Sumter and the January 6th riot, and he draws a comparison between the 2 events, or not really draws, he just kind of mentions it as kind of inspiration for writing this, or encouragement to write this.
Yeah. I think, the comparison is certainly there. It's certainly there to be made, and the people who were involved in the January 6th insurrection make the comparison themselves, right? They don't carry a Confederate flag into the U.S. Capitol by accident, right? They understand what that symbol represents, and it represents, frankly, it represents treason. And I say that as somebody whose ancestors were Confederate soldiers, right? I guess what I would say, without having read, Larson's take on it, the parallel is there. The people involved in the insurrection make it explicit, like I said, when they carry that symbol into the U.S. Capitol. I guess there's a difference, I suppose, in terms of like the mechanisms of how the Confederacy operates. They very much want to represent themselves as followers of law and order, right? They don't immediately assemble armies and attack Washington, D.C. They form secession conventions, and they write formal declarations saying we're dissolving our relationship to the Union and here's why. They form new governments. They form a new national government. So the secessionists are very intent on avoiding any association with themselves as being lawless traitors. They want to position themselves as being seen as people of principle. Yes, we're going to depose the U.S. government in a way that is actively treasonous, but we're going to sort of conduct ourselves in a way that says, what we're doing is in keeping actually with the spirit of the American Revolution. Mm-hmm. A government has become abusive to us. It is our right to abolish it. That's what we're doing. So I don't think they would have, I don't think there are many secessionists who would have liked to have been thought of as insurrectionists in the way that I think the January 6th insurrectionists were very proud of being, for lack of a better word, troublemakers, right? They're not sitting down and drafting formal declarations, right? So I don't know if that, kind of speaks to a difference, if that makes sense.
And maybe my point in it, also you could say it feels like one was more organized than the other. For example, the Anderson on Fort Sumter was given 3 days before the attack to prepare or leave, whereas the January 6th kind of seemed like just spontaneous. Let's just
spontaneous, kind of a melee. I like your word organized because a part of the reason the secessionists are again trying to position themselves as followers of some kind of law and order despite the act of treason they've committed is that they want recognition for their nation from other nations, right? So they're engaged not only in a project of insurrection, they're engaged in a project of nation building. And so they want to be seen as legitimate. They want their actions to be read as legitimate so that they can gain recognition by various international powers as being a legitimate nation. But that, like I said, the parallels are certainly there, and there's disunion is a constant theme across U.S. history. Constant threats of disunion, constant moments where there's potential insurrections. Right, some of the most famous are linked to the Hartford Convention during the War of 1812. Then there's the whole Burr and Blennerhassett conspiracy theory, where Aaron Burr decides he's gonna make himself like kind of the emperor of a Western United States, and then of course there's threats of disunion over the tariff crises during Andrew Jackson's presidency, and then the Missouri crisis, and the Civil War. So disunion and acts of insurrection or treason, nothing new. They've been with us all along, and January 6th was just sort of the most recent in our history, I think.
And for some reason I didn't put the question in, but I thought it up was, you ever hear like jokes about like or people talking about how like California or Texas always like the ones being thought of being the ones that in modern day would be the ones that succeed if there were a modern secession?
Ask me again if the people.
I hear people say it sometimes, like California seceding or Texas seceding.
Yeah.
And a couple of things I always thought about with that was, one, I feel like that would just be dangerous for them, especially in today's modern system.
Yeah, we see that every so often, right? It seems like every few years there's talk that some state might secede. The argument, after the American Civil War, the Constitution explicitly says secession is unconstitutional. You can't do it. It's illegal.
Right.
So they close that loophole. But then the challenges levied against secession now are the same things that people said in 1860, which is you can't just say you're no longer a part of the federal government when you have all kinds of federal infrastructure, right? This is the whole problem with Fort Sumter. We can secede, but that's federal property. So what happens to it, right? So the same thing now. Your highways, your schools that receive federal funding, your prisons that receive federal funding. Like, what are you going to do? How are you going to possibly support yourselves without that infrastructure? I don't know that every historian agrees with me. Like I said, you'll see these stories pop up, and Civil War historians almost always comment on them, right? To talk about, I don't see secession as being a realistic thing. And I think a part of it is also that our sense of regionalism is way too diffuse now. Yeah. I don't think, people identify with a place anymore strongly enough to be like, yeah, I'll leave the Union to become the Republic of Ohio. Maybe. I could be very wrong about that. I don't know. That's just my own personal reflection.
And again, like you said, Fort Sumter, you think about if like California seceded, or it's like naval bases like San Diego, San Francisco. I couldn't see that turning out good without some sort of mess to happen.
Right. And, you know, maybe as I'm just kind of spitballing this with you, maybe a part of the difference between 1860, the idea of secession then and now, is this planter class, right? Because I said our population is too diverse now to, I think, kind of build a unified secession movement. But as I said a minute ago, the secession movement wasn't unified in 1860 either. But you had the people in power, that tiny little group of, you know, plantation elites, people that Northerners called the fire eaters. They had enough power in that world and in that context to pull people into secession whether they wanted to go or not. And maybe that's what we're missing now. Maybe we no longer have that class that could pull a state like California into secession against its will. You would have too much. There's far too many people who are entitled now and who have a stake and who have a say in the political process who could subvert that from happening. And maybe that's a fundamental difference between secession then and now. I'm not sure.
And then another point that I hear thrown around lately is Civil War today.
Yeah.
Like, do you think it's even near that level, or
no?
No.
I mean, yeah. Again, I think the missing component is that the Confederacy is not just a secession movement; it's this nationalist movement. Certainly, Americans today have different versions of nationalism, and have strong disagreements over how the nation could and should operate. But I don't see a faction that's unified and strong enough and consistent enough in its ideology to propel something like a civil war. I could see lots of acts of sort of vigilante violence, but in terms of marshaling armies, opposing forces in the way that the Civil War was conducted, I guess I don't see that being as a likely outcome, though I could see an increase of politically motivated sort of vigilante violence in our modern context. But the thing I always kind of tell my students, and even my family, when they ask me about these things, like at Thanksgiving, right? You're a Civil War historian. What do you think about this? Things are tense now, right? The political landscape's tense. People are in their feelings. That is nothing new. That is a feature of the American political system, not a bug. For better or worse, it's always been this way. And, you know, as I rattled through a minute ago, there's been lots of moments where it seemed like the whole American experiment might fall apart. 2024 is, you got nothing new going on in that regard. So it actually gives me hope. The American democracy is kind of chaotic, and sometimes it's kind of scary. But ultimately, things have a way of working themselves out. Sometimes that comes at a cost. And in the Civil War, right, that certainly came at a cost. So I don't mean to minimize that. But things have been worse, I guess is what I'm getting at. And so I see more reasons to be optimistic about the future of a more unified, stable, healthy United States than I see reasons to be pessimistic about that.
And I think that's one of the reasons people are worried is just the discourse is just louder today than...
You know, yeah, it is in a sense, but, you know, when I have my students look at 19th century newspapers, you want to talk about discourse, like, wow. There is nothing that's said on social media today that's any more inflammatory than what people were saying in the partisan press of the 19th century. So it's just, you know, when I first started teaching, I came across a quote from this formerly enslaved woman. She's reflecting back on her life, and she says, "Times don't change, just the merchandise." And I think that's really true, right? So, yeah, the kinds of things people say and the mudslinging they get into, none of that is new. We have new ways of spreading political rhetoric and discourse, right, on the internet, on social media. But the kinds of things people are saying are really, you know, nothing's changed all that much.
And yeah, I guess you could also say maybe the last time we were dangerous of collapsing or anything might have been during the Great Depression when communism and fascism were kind of on the rise. But
yeah.
But luckily it fizzled out when World War II started. And
yeah, that's because it's kind of different than the secessionist movement, but like that isolationist movement that existed in the time period that you're talking about. Yeah, you could kind of see a parallel there. Maybe they have different intents, but in terms of representing a significant, you know, block of people with a shared ideology, that caused major fractures, then yeah, you could see a parallel there. Yeah,
No.
so there's been lots of troubled times.
Yeah.
That's for sure.
And then you are technically an educator. So as an educator, what would your advice or suggestion be for someone who wishes to get into the field of education?
Ooh, maybe if it's your passion, do it. It was certainly mine. Yeah, it's tough, but I think all jobs are tough. Except the fact that you'll never make as much money as your friends with like technical degrees.
Mm-hmm.
You will have a very fulfilling career in other ways, though. And so, yeah, I don't know what I would do if I didn't have the opportunity to talk about the history that I love and share the reasons why I think it's important with students, and see them respond to it. I mean, yeah, so I would say go into it with your eyes open. It's tough, but if it's something you're passionate about, then it's worth it. And I wouldn't pick a different career.
And then next question I had, I feel like if I were to give myself a grade level on my knowledge of the Civil War, I'd say I'm probably in toddler to.
I don't think that's true.
But my question is, what would if someone was going to come up to you and ask you, give me 5 or 10 steps to start my knowledge on the Civil War?
Ooh. What are resources you should look at, places you should go to learn more about the Civil War? That's a great question. I wish I had thought more about that before I came in here. So let me try to think of a couple. There's a really great book that came out a couple years ago by Stephanie McCurry called The Women's War. And it's a really great general history of the Civil War, but instead of sort of talking about it from the perspective of leading politicians, it talks about it from the perspectives of a number of different women: Northern, Southern, white, black, free, enslaved. And I thought that was really cool because if you don't know much about the war, you're going to understand how and why it happened. But also Stephanie McCurry is making this really fascinating argument that we talk about the Civil War as though half of the population wasn't involved in it, right? Which, of course, half being women. So I thought that was a really interesting take. So you could get a good understanding of the war and kind of a new perspective on it at the same time. Women's War is great. I grew up watching a really great series of History Channel documentaries called Civil War Combat. So if you're interested in military history, I think those are great documentaries to go to. They're probably ancient now. They're probably only available on physical media or something. I don't know. But if you can find Civil War Combat out there, that's a great one. The other thing to do to understand the Civil War, I think, also has to be going to one of the sites, right? So if there's a battlefield near you, you should go check it out because that will give you a whole, different experience than just reading about it or, watching documentaries about it. There's something about being on the ground that's really important to understand that history. And veterans knew that. That's the whole reason they preserved these battlefields in the first place, that being in that place matters. And that's a really great way to connect to the history. The other thing I would say would be to find a good primary source reader on the Civil War. Oh, I could grab the title of one off the shelf in my office. It's escaping me right now. But that failing, go to the American Battlefield Trust website. They have a great collection of primary sources from the Civil War era. And what I would definitely direct people there are the secession documents written by these various states because they explicitly talk about the reasons motivating them leaving the Union, and it's crystal clear that their primary concern is about slavery. Mm-hmm. And that's such a hot button issue when people talk about the Civil War. Was it really about slavery? Was it about something else? Well, if you go to those primary sources, particularly those secession convention documents, the answer is there. It's obvious, it's explicit. So to really understand why this happened, go to those primary sources. There's some great collections of sources out there, but the American Battlefield Trust has good ones too. There's also, if you jump on Google Books, Civil War veterans were prolific writers. And you can find so many wonderful memoirs and regimental histories written by survivors of the war. And so those are really excellent resources too. And like I said, so many of them are in the public domain now and are freely available. One of the most famous ones was written by Joshua Lawrence Chamberlain, who was a Union officer from Maine. He's very famous for his involvement at the Battle of Gettysburg. His is one that gets cited a lot. But yeah, there's lots and lots of these memoirs and sort of personal histories of the war written by people who fought it. And so those are good places to look.
Like I said, I'm really just making my first steps into learning about it myself. And for example, I'm not gloating, but I have 7 books already set for research.
Oh, great.
For that novel I want to write.
Yeah.
Because I do want to get into the mindset of the veterans themselves. Like for example, I think some of them were cavalrymen. So I have a book called Part of My Language, but it is in the title. Those Damn Horse Soldiers.
Oh, I'm not familiar with that one, but yeah.
I guess it's about the cavalry soldiers during the war. Also got the Shelby Foot soldier. I don't know how you feel about those, but
well,
too much.
Shelby Foot is very controversial within Civil War history, and more so because this is getting really into some 1990s history in fighting. It's more because of Shelby Foot's presence in the famous Ken Burns documentary, The Civil War. He gets so much airtime. And he's not a historian. He's not an academic. And he is a Confederate apologist, right? So just the way he presents himself and the way he interprets history kind of sugarcoats the Confederacy and their causes and their relationship to white supremacy. He's a wonderful writer, and particularly if you're interested in writing, sort of a historical fiction, supernatural thriller, read Shelby Foot, because he can tell a story. Just be aware as you're dealing with Shelby Foot that you're getting a very particular view,
right.
On the history. So, but yeah, Shelby Foot is like the boogeyman under the Civil War historian's bed.
Well, now I know, but still probably going to read them.
Like I said, you should. He writes very well, and he tells a beautiful story. Use with caution, basically. That's the story of Shelby Foot.
And one of the books you recommended, I asked you about PTSD with veterans.
Yeah.
I think it's called Bodies in Blue.
Oh, look. That's so funny that you mentioned it, because I was going to recommend it. That is one of the best books that I've read on the Civil War in a long time. So I highly recommend Bodies in Blue. There is another one that just came out called Living Hell. It's actually the next on my list to read, so I haven't looked at it yet. The most famous one that Civil War historians will cite that deals with this issue is called Shook Over Hell. And it explicitly relates PTSD suffered by Civil War soldiers to Vietnam era veterans. So it's bridging that gap. But yeah, Shook Over Hell, Living Hell, and Bodies in Blue, those are great places to look.
And like I said, I'm not even scratching the surface.
Yeah, no. I mean, your questions are all really good, and in some ways I feel there's better people to answer them because I'm a cultural historian. So then there's the whole military history of the Civil War, right? So I deal with military history because I'm studying the Civil War, but I'm really studying sort of, people and experiences and the culture of the Civil War era. But there's so much great military history out there. So like you referenced the book on cavalry. I haven't ever read anything on Civil War cavalry besides a couple of books about those partisan rangers. But yeah, there's just infinite amount of stuff out there. And, every Civil War historian has their own, perspective on the issue.
Again, it's not bragging because it's only 2 books, but I also read Eagles on their buttons.
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
I figured it might be a good idea to get that perspective as well.
Yeah, absolutely.
And I don't know if you would count Uncle Tom's Cabin as a Civil War book. But
well, yeah, I mean...
definitely encouraged it, right?
Yeah, absolutely. There's a legendary story that supposedly Abraham Lincoln met Harriet Beecher Stowe and said, "You're the woman who caused this little war." Uncle Tom's Cabin is almost more of a primary source in terms of, a fictionalized account of the atrocities of slavery that really fired up Northern readers and, made them more sympathetic to anti-slavery causes. It's an important important book for understanding the mentality of Civil War era America, for sure. Because not only is it a book, but it's a play. It travels around. Like, people, it's lots of people were exposed to its message.
Yeah. Yeah, I'm reading it right now. So
Yeah.
I don't know if you ever had a chance to do it, but the public library has ebooks available if you're okay with reading ebooks. I know some people have issues with it,
Yeah.
but I tend to read them when I'm on the bus. But yeah, I got the ebook for them. Every time I talk to someone, I always recommend if you could try to sign up with them, because instead of paying like $15 or something on Kindle, you could just get it for free there and read it for so much time.
It's a wonderful resource. Yeah, I'm in Trumbull County, so I could use the Youngstown Library, but yeah, I use the ebook collections through the Warren Trumbull County Library, and yeah, it's great. And audiobooks too. There's so much stuff out there. That's what's kind of amazing. I think how much the world has changed. When I started researching Civil War history, I was going to archives. I had to take index cards with me, and I was doing handwritten notes. My last book, I've researched entirely remotely. Everything was digital. Everything was from online archives, digital collections. I did not have to set foot in an archive for the second book, which is wild. And every book in the world I needed, I could either get online, like you said, or through interlibrary loan. I mean, just the whole world is really at your fingertips now in a way that wasn't true even 20 years ago, which is pretty crazy.
Yeah, okay. So, kind of wrap it up, do you have any other thoughts you want to share, or if you want to plug your book again?
Yeah. So, yeah, look for Commonwealth of Compromise, the University of Missouri Press. That's my first book. If you're interested in veterans and how people think about and interpret the history of the Civil War once it's over, if you're interested in Civil War monuments, that's the book for you. The new book is called Haunted by the Memory, Ghost Stories of the American Civil War. It's co-authored by me and my late advisor, Dr. John Neff, and that will be out with the University of Tennessee Press, hoping in spring of 26. That's the plan.
All right, and thank you for being on.
No, thank you for having me. It's really fun.
And hopefully I have you on again, especially after I read some of the Civil War books I have, so I get better questions asked.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, the questions are really good anyway, so they can only get better, which is exciting.
So we'll go ahead and wrap it up.
Okay.
Thank you for watching, and see you in the aftermath. I usually do an after video kind of.
Okay, so hopefully you enjoyed that podcast. If you did, please leave a like and comment down below. If you have any takes on the points mentioned in the podcast itself, don't be afraid to share them. Also, if you want to subscribe, I recommend doing so. It'll also help both the channel and also help you keep track of what's being released on the channel. I mentioned it for text throughout the podcast, but if you want to check out Dr. Fluker's book, the link will be in the description below. If you want to check out the novel I wrote, Black Monday, the link will be in the description as well. And also, I recommend following me on Twitter. By the way, usually when I say follow, the link is in the description. So I recommend following me on Twitter. That'll keep you in touch with what's going on, book-wise, YouTube-wise, anything-wise. And I recommend following me on Goodreads. That's a good way if you want to check to see what I'm reading. If you're interested in that sort of stuff, follow me on there. Friend request me, either or. That's up to you. And I will talk to you guys Wednesday. I am nearing the finishing of The Last Great Strike by Ahmed White. I will get that uploaded on Wednesday, and we'll see what we can do on Friday. If I get something published, that's great. If not, publish, brain, please. If I could get something read, great. If not, we'll do another language stream. And again, thank you for watching, and I'll talk to you then. Bye-bye.